The atmosphere inside the television studio was suffocating, a high-pressure vacuum where the air felt thin and the heat from the overhead lighting rig bore down like a physical weight. It was the kind of sterile, manufactured environment designed to strip away authenticity. Yet tonight, something raw was about to tear through the meticulously curated setting. Karoline Levitt sat across the glass table, her posture rigid and unyielding, reminiscent of a sentry on duty rather than a political pundit preparing for a debate. Across from her sat California Governor Gavin Newsom, a man whose entire career had been built on the art of the smooth pivot and the charming deflection. He adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit jacket, flashing that signature, camera-ready smile that had graced 1,000 magazine covers, a smile that communicated a supreme, almost bored confidence. To him, this was just another Tuesday, another opportunity to dazzle a national audience with rehearsed talking points about progress and equity. But Karoline wasn't looking at a celebrity politician. She was looking at a target, and she was armed with something far more dangerous than rhetoric. She was armed with the cold, hard reality that millions of Americans had been screaming at their television screens for years. The moderator, a veteran of the industry who had seen countless debates dissolve into shouting matches, signaled for the segment to begin, but the energy in the room had already shifted before the first word was spoken. Newsom leaned back, crossing one leg over the other in a display of relaxed dominance, looking for all the world like he was settling in for a casual chat on a friendly podcast. He began with his usual preamble, his voice smooth and practiced, speaking of compassion, of California's role as a sanctuary, and the moral obligation to welcome the stranger. It was a speech he had given 100 times, polished to a high sheen. But as he paused to take a breath, expecting the usual polite nod or soft follow-up, Karoline leaned forward. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for the producer's cue. She simply cut through the silence with a voice that was steady, sharp, and utterly devoid of the usual televised pleasantries. She asked him point-blank about the disconnect between his online preaching about equity and the reality of the veterans rotting on the streets of the cities he governed. Newsom's grin faltered, just for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of annoyance that the camera caught and magnified for the millions watching at home. He tried to brush it off, to launch into a diatribe about housing initiatives, but Karoline was relentless. She wasn't interested in the broad strokes of policy. She wanted to talk about the grim details. She brought up the sanctuary hotels in Beverly Hills, the luxury accommodations provided to those who had violated federal laws to enter the country, and contrasted it violently with the image of a Vietnam veteran she knew, a man who had lost a limb for his country, sleeping under a trash bag on a cracked sidewalk in Los Angeles. She asked him, with a burning intensity, if he dared to call that equity. The question hung in the air, sucking the oxygen out of the room. A ripple of gasps moved through the live audience, a sound that wasn't prompted by an applause sign but was a genuine, visceral reaction to the brutality of the comparison. Newsom raised a manicured hand, attempting to regain control of the floor, to spin the narrative back to his comfort zone of complex socioeconomic factors. But Karoline cut him off before he could even form the first syllable of his defense. She declared that this wasn't a debate class. This was about the truth. She accused him of spending millions on border crossers while leaving America's heroes with crumbs. She demanded to know who he actually served, a question that struck at the very heart of his political identity. The moderator, usually quick to interrupt and enforce time limits, sat stunned, frozen by the sheer force of the indictment. The producers in the control room didn't cut to commercial. They knew they were witnessing television gold, the kind of unscripted, dangerous moment that networks live for. No one blinked. Newsom was stuck in his chair, blinking into the harsh spotlight, the script he had memorized suddenly useless against an opponent who refused to play by the established rules of engagement. When Newsom finally found his voice, he tried to adopt a tone of condescension, the voice of a patient teacher explaining a difficult concept to a slow student. He dragged out her name, patronizingly, speaking about humanity and claiming that California leads with compassion. But Karoline raised her hand, a sharp, stopping motion that silenced him instantly. Her voice dropped an octave, becoming colder and more precise. She dismantled his claim of compassion, labeling it as mere theatrics. She pointed out the hypocrisy of building luxury migrant shelters mere steps away from the squalor of Skid Row, of handing out hotel vouchers like candy to new arrivals while veterans waited months, sometimes years, for a simple bed at the VA. The camera panned to the audience, capturing the face of a woman in a faded military jacket wiping tears from her eyes, and a man in a Marine Corps ball cap clenching his jaw so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. The room was no longer a neutral ground. It had become a tribunal. Newsom tried to pivot again, desperate to find footing on the slippery slope Karoline had created. He brought up the housing crisis, claiming they were fixing it for everyone, that it was a tide that would lift all boats. Karoline fired back immediately, her knowledge of his own legislation weaponized against him. She cited SB 1845, a bill that had prioritized undocumented immigrants for state-funded rent aid, placing them ahead of struggling American citizens. Newsom blinked rapidly. That specific bill hadn't been mentioned in the mainstream press in months. He had assumed it was buried under the news cycle. But Karoline had done her homework. She smiled then, a dangerous, knowing smile, and told him she had seen the receipts. She had spoken to the families. She wasn't just accusing him of funding illegal immigration. She was accusing him of prioritizing it over the very people who had built the country he was now selling out. The energy in the studio had shifted entirely. What had started as a polite political discourse had transformed into a reckoning. Murmurs of agreement began to rise from the audience, a low hum of dissent against the governor that was growing louder by the second. Newsom looked down at his notes, his polished image cracking under the sustained pressure. Karoline pressed her advantage. She spoke of the people left behind, the ones who bled for the flag, the ones now standing in humiliation in food bank lines while he bragged on Instagram about welcoming the world. The moderator finally found his voice, asking the governor if he would like to respond, but the tone of the question had changed. It wasn't a soft lob anymore, it was a challenge. Newsom opened his mouth, but for the first time in his career, nothing of substance came out. He was watching his narrative crumble in real time. Karoline didn't wait for him to regroup. She stepped forward, physically leaning into his personal space, her eyes locking onto his with a ferocity that made him flinch. She painted a picture of him holding gold shovels at ribbon-cutting ceremonies for migrant centers while veterans were buried under silence and bureaucracy. Desperate for relief, Newsom looked to the moderator, but there was no help coming. Karoline reached into her blazer and pulled out a single, folded piece of paper. The sound of the paper unfolding was amplified by the microphones, a crisp, sharp noise that echoed like a gunshot in the silent studio. She told him that since he liked data, they should talk numbers. She read off the damning statistics. Billions for migrant health care, billions for housing undocumented immigrants, and a pittance for veteran services. Allocations made even after veterans groups had protested outside his very office. She folded the paper slowly, staring him down, and asked if that was his definition of equity. The crowd's murmurs grew into audible gasps and scattered applause. Newsom cleared his throat, his voice tight, claiming it was a complex issue. Karoline cut him down instantly. She called it cowardice, not complexity. She accused him of funding illegal immigration because it was politically useful, because that demographic didn't demand accountability yet, but they kept his narrative of benevolence alive. Newsom's jaw clenched, the veins in his neck visible. Karoline continued, describing the reality for veterans who earned their place in this country. Rationed mental health care, endless red tape, and a cot if they were lucky. In the front row, an older man with medals pinned to his chest stood up, a silent testament to her words. Applause followed him, a wave of support that washed over the stage. Karoline told Newsom to remember that man every time he posted a filtered selfie with a refugee success story. She reminded him that somewhere in his state, a veteran was choosing between paying rent and buying insulin. Newsom laughed nervously, a sound that betrayed his anxiety. He tried the compassionate state line again, claiming they don't turn people away. Karoline tilted her head, acknowledging that he was right. He didn't turn them away. Instead, he turned his back on the ones who were already here. The room erupted. It was a line that struck a nerve so deep it resonated far beyond the studio walls. The audience, the viewers at home, everyone felt the weight of that accusation. Karoline turned her body fully toward him now, abandoning any pretense of a dual interview. She told him that hope doesn't come from coddling lawbreakers. It comes from honoring sacrifice. Newsom snapped, his composure finally breaking. He asked sarcastically what she would have them do: line people up at the border and turn them away at gunpoint? He claimed that wasn't who we are. Karoline stared at him coldly, her voice dropping to a whisper that was louder than a scream. She told him he didn't even know who we are. She spoke of a nation built by law and declared that when the law means nothing, when you reward those who break it and punish those who defend it, you don't have a state. You have a circus. The moderator shifted uncomfortably, trying to intervene, but Karoline raised a hand, demanding to finish. She addressed the years of gaslighting, where politicians like Newsom had painted people like her as cruel for demanding that American citizens be prioritized. She rejected the label of hatred, explaining that they didn't hate others, but they loved their own country too much to watch it fall apart, while politicians catered to the rest of the world. She challenged Newsom to tell the audience how he slept at night while veterans slept on concrete, how he cried at border photo ops but never visited the decaying VFW halls. The silence in the room was thunderous, a heavy, expectant weight. She stepped closer, accusing him of using the word compassion like a weapon to bludgeon his critics. But compassion without order, she argued, is just chaos in disguise, and his chaos was killing people. Newsom's face turned a mottled red. He stammered that he would not be lectured by someone who had never run a state. Karoline snapped back that she was right. She hadn't run a state, because she still believed in serving a country, not managing its collapse. The crowd exploded into a standing ovation. Even those who might have disagreed with her politics couldn't deny the power of the moment. Newsom turned to the moderator, visibly rattled, asking if they were going to let her turn the interview into a campaign rally. Karoline smiled, stone cold, and told him that if he didn't like the heat, he should stop lighting the fire. Newsom sat back down, lips pressed tight, his eyes betraying a deep, gnawing fear. He knew the dynamic had shifted, not just in the room, but in the country. Newsom tried one last gambit. He leaned forward, forcing a grin that didn't reach his eyes, and questioned her personal experience. He asked how many refugees she had actually spoken to, how many mothers crossing deserts she had looked in the eye. It was a trap, meant to paint her as privileged and out of touch. But Karoline didn't flinch. She stepped forward with calm defiance and told him she had looked into the eyes of mothers who lost sons in Afghanistan. She had held the hand of a Marine's father at Arlington Cemetery. She told him not to talk to her about compassion unless he had stood in a living room when the folded flag arrived. The gasps in the room were audible. The moderator's eyes widened. The audience was rapt, hanging on every syllable. The air was heavy with the rare presence of truth on live television. Karoline continued, clarifying that she wasn't heartless. She didn't want children suffering. But she reminded everyone that the nation was $33 trillion in debt, cities were crumbling, and veterans were dying by suicide in motel rooms, while the administration handed out state IDs and taxpayer housing to people who entered illegally. When Newsom tried to interrupt, she cut him off, forbidding him from using the word undocumented, like a magic spell to erase the reality of the situation. These were illegal entries. She laid out the binary choice. You either believe in borders or you believe in chaos. There was no middle ground. She attacked his reputation, built on Napa dinners while his state sank into fentanyl overdoses and homelessness. She accused him of writing checks to people who broke in instead of fixing what was broken. Newsom tried to laugh it off, calling it a cute speech for Twitter clicks. Karoline pointed directly at the camera, breaking the fourth wall. She declared this wasn't for Twitter. It was for every American family that had to bury a veteran while their tax dollars paid for hotel rooms for illegal gang members. The room went silent again. Newsom's smirk faded entirely. She delivered the final blow, telling him that if he wanted to talk about real compassion, he should start by apologizing to the people he forgot, the ones who fought for the flag, not the ones who snuck under it. The audience erupted, a chaotic mix of cheers and stunned silence. The moment had landed. Karoline hadn't just challenged his policies. She had exposed his moral compass, or the lack thereof. For a flicker of a second, Gavin Newsom knew he was losing the narrative. The commercial break was approaching, and the control room was in a state of panic. Producers were shouting orders, camera angles were shifting erratically, and Newsom sat rigid, blinking rapidly. He knew the momentum had turned, and it wasn't coming back. Karoline didn't wait for the next question. She addressed the panel, dismantling the claim that California was a model for the nation. She called it failure in high definition, skyrocketing homelessness, drug-ridden streets, and veterans dying while waiting for care, all while illegal immigrants were greeted with hotel keys and debit cards. When Newsom tried to interject that they were simply showing humanity, Karoline turned sharply. She told him humanity wasn't about photo ops. It was about how you treat your own people when the cameras are off. The murmur of agreement in the studio grew louder. Journalists were scribbling furiously. Karoline brought up the $24 million program for free legal counsel for illegals, contrasting it with a friend's father, a Vietnam vet with stage 4 cancer who had to crowdfund his chemotherapy. She called that his legacy. When Newsom accused her of mischaracterizing, she snapped that she was exposing. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She explained that this is what happens when elites care more about applause from activists than answers for Americans. She listed the hypocrisies, calling border enforcement racist while Marines slept in trucks, using COVID funds to shelter illegals in 4-star hotels while citizens lost their homes. She asked him if he wanted to run for president one day. Newsom didn't respond, his eyes narrowing. She smiled, a look of grim finality, and told him to let this be his introduction, the man who funded strangers while his own people begged for help. The crowd didn't clap immediately. They were too stunned. It was a political obituary delivered live. As the lights dimmed for the break, the network went to commercial, but the internet caught fire. Within seconds, clips of the takedown were exploding across every social media platform. Hashtags favoring veterans over illegals rocketed to the top of the trending lists. Even liberal-leaning pages were forced to share the moment, acknowledging its power. Back in the green room, Newsom paced, his jaw tight, hands shaking. His advisors whispered damage control strategies, suggesting pivots and statements, but Gavin wasn't listening. He was watching the clip on a phone, hearing Karoline's precise, relentless voice echoing louder than the applause. He muttered that she had ambushed him, but an aide whispered the truth. She had simply shown up prepared. Meanwhile, Karoline was still on set. A producer told her she had 5 more minutes if she wanted them. She didn't blink. She agreed immediately. When the cameras went live again, the moderator tried to shift to a lighter topic, asking what Republicans could offer struggling Americans. Karoline didn't smile. She said simply, dignity and priorities. She spoke of her father, who served in Iraq and came home asking for a job, not a handout. She spoke of a country that should look its heroes in the eye and tell them they matter more than someone who broke the laws. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. She admitted that if defending the people who built the nation made her controversial, she accepted the label. She would rather be controversial for defending patriots than celebrated for selling them out. She concluded by challenging the audience to face the truth. If the government continued putting illegal immigrants above veterans and working families, they didn't have a border problem. They had a leadership crisis. The producers signaled 30 seconds left. Karoline used every one of them. She told the viewers that the next time Newsom lectured the country about compassion, they should ask him where that compassion was when veterans were dying on sidewalks. She dropped her tone for the final sentence. If he doesn't answer, you already know why. The feed cut, and the interview ended, but Karoline had just begun. Her phone lit up with thousands of messages, veterans, mothers, former Democrats, thanking her. Screenshots of her speech became memes. A TikTok of a homeless veteran watching her clip from a soup kitchen went viral with the caption, "Finally, someone sees us." Newsom's team scrambled, releasing a hastily drafted statement about their investments in veteran services, trying to frame Karoline as politicizing a complex issue. But it was too late. The viewers weren't buying the spin. Comments flooded YouTube uploads, validating Karoline's points with personal stories of neglect. In Sacramento, Newsom's advisors panicked as internal polling showed a drop in trust. Veterans groups that had remained neutral began to speak up, demanding Newsom earn their vote. Karoline, sitting in the studio hallway, didn't need to read the feedback. She felt it. This was personal. It was her father's silence, her mother's worry, her childhood marked by forgotten promises. A producer told her it was raw, and she replied that it was necessary. She wasn't ready to leave. She was ready to keep going. That night, While Newsom flew back to California on a government-funded jet, Karoline boarded a red-eye to Ohio. A rally of 12,000 people was waiting. There were no teleprompters, just the truth. By morning, her clip was defining the national conversation. Major newspapers ran the story on the front page. In Washington, strategists realized this wasn't just a moment, it was a movement. Local news stations replayed the speech. Military moms hosted watch parties. In California, the backlash against Newsom hardened. Veterans marched on Sacramento. Protests sprang up in San Diego. Senator Joe Manchin broke his silence, agreeing with Karoline on live radio, stunning the political establishment. Karoline arrived in Columbus and went straight to a war memorial. Under a cold, gray sky, she knelt beside a monument. A small group of veterans gathered, no cameras, just men and women who had driven hours to shake her hand. An amputee in a battered army jacket handed her a dog tag, telling her he had been waiting years for someone to say what she said. Karoline held the tag, her throat tight. She whispered that she wasn't a politician, she was a soldier's daughter. That was the moment she knew this fight was about dignity. That night, she was invited back to the network for a primetime segment. The host introduced her as the woman who lit the match that set the truth ablaze. She stepped onto the set in a navy blue blazer with a small American flag pin. The applause was thunderous. She looked directly at the camera and spoke of the hundreds of veterans she had heard from in the last 24 hours. Real people, not bots. She spoke of men sleeping in trucks and women begging for insulin while the governor wrote checks for non-citizens. She called it betrayal, refusing to let them disguise it as equity. The screen split to show veterans watching from Sacramento, fists raised. Karoline's voice cracked for a second as she acknowledged the attacks against her, the names she had been called. But she declared that the truth terrified the elites because it pulled back the curtain on their failures. She delivered the line that would be replayed for weeks. She would rather be hated for standing up than loved for selling out. The host asked if she was planning to run for office. Karoline smiled faintly and said she was already running, not for office, but for every soul the government had forgotten. As the segment ended, social media exploded with calls for her to run. Consultants whispered that she was the real deal. But Karoline didn't go to an after-party. She went to her hotel room, took off her blazer, and sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the dog tag. Somewhere in California, Newsom's team stayed up all night, but the damage was done. The daughter of a veteran had changed the political landscape. She stood alone, but she spoke for millions. While politicians handed out comfort to outsiders, Karoline Leavitt handed the truth to the American people, raw, unfiltered, and unstoppable. She didn't blink when the cameras rolled. She didn't flinch when the backlash came. She wasn't fighting for headlines. She was fighting for the veterans sleeping in parking lots and the patriots crushed by broken promises. When the governor tried to smear her, she doubled down. In a country where silence is easy and lies are profitable, she chose the harder path of truth. That truth hit harder than any talking point ever could. From Capitol Hill to every kitchen table in America, people were finally asking why the country funded illegals while heroes went hungry. It wasn't just a speech, it was a wake-up call. If the political elite didn't hear it, the people did. She had stood up, and she was nowhere near done yet.